It's been a crazy week for the news. And Adam Posen is the perfect guy to help us catch up with what's happened, what it's going to mean, and fit it into a longer term perspective. The Peterson Institute for International Economics is one of the leading nonpartisan research organizations on international economic issues. Speak for myself, that's exactly what we need in the current situation. We've had some of the Peterson scholars at the Roundtable in previous years. You may remember Carmen Reinhardt and David Wilcox both gave fantastic talks. And today we're going to hear from the guy on top. Adam Posen is the president of the Peterson Institute. Among many honors, he was elected a distinguished fellow of the Center for Economic Policy and Research. He received the Order of the Rising Sun from Japan, and was named an honorary commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II. So if any of you have done that, raise your hand, we'll get you up here too. But that's our guest for today. I can assure you that's an accomplishment I don't have. Adam has written a very nice book, co-authored with Ben Bernanke, another guy you probably heard of, and who also we had at the Roundtable many years ago. Please join me in welcoming Adam Posen.
Good morning. Thanks to everyone who came out in the fog, and thanks very much to the economics department and in particular Professor Hamilton for having me. I've had a lot of regard for both Jim's work and for the general quality and relevance of so much work done at UCSD. An alum of our Peterson Institute is now the dean of your School of Graduate Policy Studies, Carolyn Freund. And anyway, it's very nice for me to be here. I particularly want to thank not just the sponsors, but I guess Garrett in particular for making it possible for undergrads to participate. That is additional attraction for me to participate. So as Jim said, this has been quite a week. We at the Peterson Institute have been kind of warning the officials, the markets, public, to the extent anyone would pay attention, for about 8 months now, that the Trump program of international economics was likely to actually implement many of the things he was talking about, and then implementing them would be bad. And what has happened is, as recently as 2 weeks ago, today, I was giving a off-the-record briefing to a group of G20 officials, and I was asked to give my assessment of what I thought would take place in terms of tariffs, but also I wanted to emphasize to them migration policy, fiscal policy, other things. And they welcomed my remarks, but they greeted me with sort of disbelief and skepticism as late as 2 weeks ago. He's not really going to do that, or if he does that, it's horrendous, or maybe it won't be so bad. And what's particularly scary about that is what I was projecting was going to be undertaken by the new administration was less radical than what has actually been undertaken. And I was already seen as the responsible edge of alarmism. Now, all of this can unwind. So what I'd like to do is today try to take you through, and Jim and I discussed ahead of time, obviously, what I was going to talk about. I'm going to try to take you through sort of some longer term issues in both the US and China and US-China relations, sort of give a background, partly economic, partly political economy, mostly at the intersection of social science and political economy, of why we are where we are and what that may mean going forward for markets, for policy. But ultimately, the reason I threw in this little subtitle, or is it all moot now, is, as I'll mention, and as I had been saying, there was always a chance that if the Trump administration was too aggressive in its pursuit too quickly of certain economic goals, it would backfire, and that could, in a sense, blow things up and change the game. I am not suggesting that is even now necessarily the base case, but this is a radical program. And what I'll go into is, I think what President Xi has been doing the last several years in China is also a radical program. And both are in contradiction, to put it nicely, of what mainstream economics would tell you is probably productivity or stability enhancing. And so we have to confront the fact that this is potentially a destabilizing situation if you have the two largest economies with, in one case, a true dictator, in another case, a reasonably autocratic leaning leader pursuing these kinds of policies. Anyway, so let me start with the Trump International Economic Program. And so already before this last week, with the announcement of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, as well as China, and oddly bigger on Canada and Mexico than on China, we had certain market themes, that there was a sense among the major other governments, including China, but also Japan, the EU, Australia, Britain, South Korea, that they were going to wait to see what was happening with Trump. They were not going to, as Prime Minister Abe from Japan did last time, get out early with an offer to Trump. Second, that, and this was seen in the discussions at Davos, which is not really important for anything except as sort of a marker where the CEO class is thinking, that AI has become the topic of the day, even before DeepSeek, and the green and other sustainability initiatives and our ESG initiatives are just gone. And by the way, I'm telling you things as I see them, not as I like them to be, just to be clear. So when I say there's nothing on financial regulation or global cooperation, I'm not saying, oh boy, or I wish for that outcome, but I'm saying that we're in a situation where those things are now just very much off the agenda. And there is also, largely for energy price reasons, but other reasons as well, a very large scale shift of heavy industry from the EU into the US, into Southeast Asia. There's a big irony here. 30 some odd years ago, 35 years ago, Larry Summers, who some of you know or have obviously seen, caused a huge kerfuffle at the World Bank when he was chief economist and suggested there might be reason to move dirty industries, high energy, high waste industries to the developing world and out of the rich world, the high income world. And now 30 years later, we've stood that on our head, and the US is fighting to get as much dirty industry as possible into the US. So just a note. I think also, although this isn't the focus of my talk, the important reminder is that there are a lot of nations out there with agency. It's not just the US and China or even Europe. And there are a bunch of other cleavages and differences and flows. I think what is the two that you all should in particular be paying attention to is, first, that the major emerging markets, notably India, Indonesia, Mexico until this week, and Brazil, arguably Poland and Turkey, are separated. It's not separating, are now really separated from the rest of the emerging market space. There was a long period where when the US would do Fed tightening cycles, or there was so-called risk on, risk off cycles when money would flow into emerging markets as a class and flow out. And what we've seen over the last several years, including during COVID, including during the Fed cycle, is that these large emerging markets have actually had much more macro space, much more stability, financial and otherwise. But the developing world beyond them, the poorer countries, the smaller countries, again, there's a couple exceptions, but in the broad, have been in real trouble. And again, this isn't a statement of what's good or bad. How do you weigh the fact that you combine Brazil, Mexico, India, Indonesia, it's a couple billion people, so this is good. But the sort of totally leaving behind Egypt, South Asia, outside of India, Central America is not good. So it's just a factual statement that we've seen, and I forecast this a couple of years ago, we've seen this divergence. So there's a lot of things going on. Now, when we look at what the Trump administration priorities are, taking Trump at his word, which he's delivered on, tariffs are his number one in terms of international economics. Deregulation is number two. Three is migration, and I'll come back to that. And obviously here in San Diego, you're very aware of these issues, but you know, it is important for everybody in the US. Fourth, and ultimately the most significant in some ways, is what's going to happen on taxes and the budget. And in a sense, it's a blessing that the Republicans, from a governance point of view, that the Republicans hold the majority in both houses of Congress, because it incentivizes Trump to go through normal budget processes because his party is in control of both houses. We're already seeing with some of the activities by Elon Musk and others, encouraged by President Trump, to end run some of the budget process. But anyway, that will take place. And very far down the list, I put it as number 5, but it's really like number 12, is sanctions and export controls, which were central, absolutely central to the Biden administration's agenda. So there's a number of big shifts. At a macro level, and Professor Hamilton and others may have different views, but I think, and my colleagues at the Pearson Institute, we all have to varying degrees the same scenario. Again, unless they blow things up in a very overt, abrupt way, which is entirely possible, we're looking at a cycle that would be a couple of years of boom in the US, a lot of capital inflows, a stronger dollar, not because the set of policies is necessarily good, but it is akin to the 1980s, that you have a loose fiscal policy, a tightening with a lag monetary policy, geopolitical pressure, encouraging capital inflows into the US, trade protectionism, encouraging capital inflows into the US, and deregulation, some of which is constructive and some of which is just pumping up the stock market. But all of that points to sort of a boom bust cycle. Now, when we think about tariffs, and I'm assuming this group doesn't need me to define tariffs, and you don't suffer from some of the delusions that various commentators do. But when you think about tariffs there and the way the Trump administration has to deal with them, there are 4 fundamental trade-offs. The big one, which is Trump, to my surprise, decided to ignore, is that the way the US budget system works, if you were to pass the tariffs as legislation by Congress, not by emergency order of the president, then they become current law and they're assumed to remain in place till repeal. And in that case, you get to count the revenues you collect from the tariffs towards the budget negotiations. If the tariffs are imposed by the president by emergency order or executive order, which is what he's doing right now, then they can be lifted at any time. And in fact, they're supposed to expire at a certain point, even though they don't usually, but they're supposed to expire. So officially speaking, you can't count the tariff revenues towards the budget negotiations because it's not a multi-year thing that people can count on. And this is arcana, but it's actually really important, especially since the tax revenues, if you do across the board tariffs, are non-trivial. Kimberly Klossing and Maury Obstfeld, 2 colleagues of mine at Pearson, who are also in the UC system, did some estimates for us. And if you do across the board 10% tariffs, you get on the order of 1.5% of GDP a year in tax revenue. Over a 10-year window, it tends to go down over time because there's some reaction to the tariffs. You move money out because people spend less on the tariff goods. But if it's across the board, it's harder to substitute. Whereas if you do tariffs just on China, just on Mexico, even as big as they are, there's other places in the world you can get stuff from. So the tariff revenue declines faster. Anyways, this is a non-trivial amount of money. But if you do that, then you don't get to do what President Trump always said he wanted to do, which is negotiate, which is go to Canada and say, I want you to do this on fentanyl and this on migration and buy this much natural gas, boom, boom, boom. And then go to South Korea and say, I want you to build chips for me and put chips plants in the US, and then go to the UK. He can't do that if he legislates, if the Congress legislates tariffs. So that's a big trade-off. Do you want the revenue or do you want the negotiating? A second trade-off related is your goal from the tariffs to induce changes in the industrial structure of the US or not? If your goal is ultimately to induce changes, then you have to put on pretty high tariffs to make it at all in any business's interest to, say, get into an industry that the US wasn't in. You either have to subsidize a lot or put on tariffs a lot or some combination. This is what we saw with the CHIPS Act and the Biden administration subsidies. On the other hand, if you do that, then you start getting much bigger prospects of inflation, because you're both on the fiscal side and on the relative price side, you're making a bigger shot. Another set of trade-offs is the dollar. As it seems a lot of people have realized, but that may reflect my biased Twitter and Blue Sky feeds, what we and other standard macroeconomics warns people is the trade imbalances are driven by savings and investment decisions. And so if you're trying to affect the trade imbalance by tariffs, what happens is you get an offsetting response in the currency. Basically, you put on tariffs, the dollar goes up. As an empirical rule of thumb, reasonably robust, not terribly precise, is the dollar tends to go up 50% of what the trade-weighted version of your tariffs are. So if you're putting 50% tariffs on 10% of your trade, that's worth 5% trade-weighted roughly, and the dollar goes up 2.5% trade-weighted on average. There's variation in this, but the basic idea is you offset some of the effects of the dollar. And Trump, and in particular Kevin Hassett and Scott Bessent, who are his key economic cabinet members, are very aware that a strong dollar isn't good for your trade deficit. It might be good for other things, but if you care about the trade deficit, this sort of defeats your purpose. The final thing, which is a very Washington thing, but actually is very meaningful, is how much of the money you collect from tariffs do you decide to disperse in compensating the people who are affected by the tariffs? So part of the reason the tariffs, which were much, much smaller and much, much narrower under Trump 1, didn't have as big an effect as some people thought they would, was because they took almost all the money and compensated like the soybean farmers in the US who lost sales to China. Now, from the point of view of the farmers, it's a second best. It's not a terrible second best. From the point of view of the economy, it's a kind of, to use a technical expression, ass backwards way to run a policy. And so anyway, these are some of the issues. And to be very clear, the Trump administration has not stated a strategy with any clarity on any of these issues. And in fact, on the first two, and arguably number 3, they've been all over the map. Now, colleagues of mine at the Pearson Institute, Warren McKibben, Megan Hogan, and Marcus Nolan, have done a bunch of simulations using a pre-existing macro model that tries to combine trade and macro aspects created by Warren McKibben. And these are some simulations. This is the extreme case, for example, of if the US were to deport essentially all the undocumented, unauthorized workers in the US. And it's an enormous effect on the US. The important point is that the deportation shock is very big for the US and not very big internationally. The effects internationally come through whatever recession we get in the US. And the effects in the US mostly come through 2 sectors, which is residential construction, because in the US, except for very large apartment buildings, as you're all probably aware, it's small contractors who build the single family houses, the small apartment buildings, the townhouses in the US. And their workforce is roughly 50% undocumented migrants. And so if you shut down these migrants, you will basically shut down housing construction in the US, as opposed to commercial real estate, which is done by unionized workers who are either natives or documented. Anyway, I just put this in here just to say, put down a marker if people want to learn more about this. We have work at Peterson on this. And just to say, in the absence of a global trade war or a China-US major conflict, the migration effects on the US economy are actually potentially much larger, or the anti-migration effects, I should say. So what do I think happens? The most likely scenario, despite the last week, is that Trump will continue to want to have this negotiating ability bilaterally and be able to tie, like I was trying to give examples before, particular deals to particular countries, depending on whether they're in the auto sector, they're a national security ally, they import US natural gas, whatever, or he wants to blame them for American fentanyl consumption. In which case, and this was the forecast I made before things happened, worry about China and Mexico, worry about the auto sector, worry about pharmaceuticals and a few hardware sectors, and then don't think you're going to get a huge amount of tax revenue out of this. Now, we did not see coming, I did not see coming more than a token attack on Canada. The assumption I made was they would go after Canada to put on a little bit of veil that this wasn't all entirely anti-Mexico, and because Trump wanted the conservatives to win in Canada, and that may still turn out to be the case. But the extent to which things escalated with Canada has been a surprise. The biggest alternative is, in terms of scenarios, which I put a low but rising probability on, is that the Republicans in Congress use an across-the-board tariff to be a way station to trying to shift from a corporate tax system to a VAT tax system. And in particular, citing Alan Auerbach, who some of you know, who's a professor at Berkeley, Kevin Hassett, who's a student of Alan's, is advocating what he calls a destination-based cash flow tax, which is essentially a value-added tax with extra discouraging of imports. And the idea is this would over time be used to replace the corporate tax. This would be a major shift in tax incidence, and my colleagues Kim Klausing and Mary Lovely have talked about this. So it seems unlikely Congress would go for this, but if you're stuck with a president who insists on putting on across-the-board tariffs, this would be a way of making the most macro sense out of it. Let me skip the Fed forecast. So I do think there is a danger to be on this boom-bust cycle, that if they're too aggressive on anti-migration, or if they do pass this DBCFT, you could get a sharp shock to residential construction, to agriculture, to home health care. I only mentioned one sector. Sorry, those are two of the other sectors. Migrants, key, undocumented migrants are key. You also have the potential this causes inflation, and the people massively reprice the likelihood the Fed's going to tighten. Any of these could cut off the boom cycle and actually make a stagflation scenario. Another thing which is completely exogenous to the Trump people is we could be in the midst of a productivity surge. If you look at the last 9 or 10 quarters of data, productivity growth has been above trend meaningfully on average. And we can debate or speculate, is a better word, whether that's AI yet, whether that's previous things that happened, whether that's likely to continue. But you should at least entertain the possibility that the US may get bailed out because we have a surge in productivity growth that's sustained that offsets some of the harms of these other. Now, let me talk a bit about China, which I hope I didn't disappoint you all by going through Trump, even though this was labeled a China talk. Now, about 1.5 years ago, I published an argument called The End of China's Economic Miracle, which has frankly been borne out by events. Basically, my argument is that things started to shift when President Xi consolidated power around the start of 2015, but that COVID, the way they handled COVID, close crackdowns in China was a major turning point. And what you had was a break in savings behavior, risk aversion, and particular towards liquidity and self-insurance among households and small businesses in China. And as you might expect, the distinction between households and small businesses is very small, Not every household has a small business, but basically every small business is financed by a household. And there's a political economy point, but essentially what happened was from Deng Xiaoping in 79 until roughly 2015, and then very visibly in 2020, you had a no politics, no problem compact, that it was glorious to get rich, and as long as you were not criticizing the party or politically agitating, like Jack Ma or some of the people in Hong Kong, you were left alone. You might have to occasionally pay a bribe. You had to send your kids to CCP training, but basically nobody bothered you. Starting during the COVID, there was a huge uptick in the intervention, the visible in your face intervention of the Communist Party in everyday Han Chinese lives. Now, I'm not glossing over Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities who were getting oppressed by the Chinese Communist Party or political dissidents. But for the 80, 90, 95% of the Chinese population that identifies as Han and was apolitical, this was a big shift. Suddenly, overnight, you would lose access to your livelihood. It would be an arbitrary decision. This side of the street and everything east, you can't leave your house. This side of the street and everything west, you can't. And this was a very big shift. And what you see is there was in the data, I have to update the chart, so I apologize. I don't have good charts for this at the moment. But you see basically a step down shift, a very large step down shift in there isn't exact data, but basically private sector investment and household durables purchases. And you see a very large upshift in the relative share of savings going into liquid savings liquid savings products as opposed to more liquid. Now, the housing crisis, the real estate crisis in China obviously abets some of this, but that kicks in a few years later. You see this downshift with the COVID. And the key point is that China does not have the revenge spending or the return to pre-COVID normal of saving that we see in other countries. So if you look at the countries on the left, which is this from a study by De Sawyers et al., basically savings rate goes up, savings rate comes back down. If you look at the countries on the right, even in Singapore, savings rate goes up, savings rate comes back down, a lesser degree in Israel. China, it just stays flat. The savings rate just doesn't respond post-COVID. And there's a bunch of political scientists and reporters, this is just one example, who stress just how draconian the COVID crackdown was for the average Chinese. In addition, during this period, and this got almost no commentary in the West, rather than people saying in China, oh, we may have overdone it, it was the opposite. They increased the emergency law powers of the Chinese party. Now, again, it's not that they couldn't do this anyway, but it's just institutionalizing it sends a signal to the Chinese people. And colleagues of mine at Peterson, Tianlei Huang and Nicholas Veron, have a tracker where they keep track of what's state or mixed ownership or private companies, in China. Now, again, you can say, well, the party gets involved in all of them, and that's true, but they have evidence that there are clear differences in returns and in behavior in these three categories. The non-public firms tend to have higher returns and more market-like behavior in a meaningful way, even though the party's there. And what you see is around 2020, the share of the economy going to the market capitalization. And if you were to look at the credit creation, which Nick Lardy and Tianlei Huang have done, you'll see a similar pattern that basically lending to the private sector peaks in around 2015, 2016, and the share of lending going to private sector goes down. And again, that strongly precedes the real estate collapse. In fact, that was on net despite the real estate collapse, the real estate boom before the collapse. So what we've seen, and this is only through 2022, I apologize, but what we've seen is just no response of private investment on net, and a lot of this is driven by the small business sector, to the various monetary easing, fiscal measures, regulatory stimulus. And this is what I call economic long COVID, that the Chinese average household, the Chinese small business is not willing to respond to policy the way they once did because they're self-insuring and they're scared of how policy may go back and forth. So there is this longer term issue in China where they are growing more slowly on trend. They are less, the economy is less responsive to policy, and I would argue this relates to deliberate choices made by Xi and the Communist Party leadership, which frankly, the interaction of rivalry between the US and China reinforces. That Xi wants more control, he wants more self-sufficiency within the economy, he wants a bigger role for state-owned enterprises, he wants the young people of China, in the oft-translated phrase, to eat bitterness, to be ready to sacrifice for the sake of China's well-being and national defense, all of which reinforces, in my view, this economic long COVID lack of response to stimulus and growth. So what does it mean to have US-China trouble get worse? And what I want to emphasize is, you know, beyond economics, there is this whole set of international relations, foreign policy issues between the US and China, including, some of you are well familiar with the conceptual questions of, fundamentally, is the US the hegemonic power and China's the rival, and so all the rest is window dressing. So this is like Thucydides. The Harvard Kennedy School professor Graham Allison has referred to the Thucydides trap, which is the idea that the rising power inherently threatens the dominant power, and then the dominant power has an incentive to try to keep the rising power down. And you only need to look across campus to Susan Shirk and her colleagues at the US-China Center here, who've done a lot of really important and interesting work on US-China relations. Think about this. But taking it from an economic aspect, this struck me as the big question. And I would pose it to national security and foreign policy types in Washington, and they would always be stumped. Do you think the US is better off if you want a weak or a strong Chinese economy? And just to do this, I didn't give the exact quotes because they're somewhat rambling, but basically in a couple speeches in spring of 2023, then President Biden says, we are threatened by China's economic competitiveness, its dominance in certain sectors. For national security reasons, we have to foil them. A few months later, when the Chinese economic slowdown became more evident, and maybe you read my foreign affairs article, although I doubt it, in a couple speeches in August and September, President Biden says, we are concerned that China's economic difficulties may lead to actually greater aggression and risk-taking abroad. What the Americans tend to call the wag the dog scenario, that you're trying to distract from problems at home by creating international conflict and attention drawing away. And these, I'm picking on President Biden because of course he matters, he mattered. But you know, this was true throughout a wide range of people in the national security space and the foreign policy space in Washington. And so their knee-jerk response is always China economy good, bad for US. But then there would be the more sophisticated types who would say, oh, China economy bad, they make it more aggressive. Now, these are not literally contradictory. The first claim is about capabilities. We don't want China to have more economic power or more dominance in certain industries, because then they could do something to us. The second is about intent. We don't want China's leadership feeling threatened and having to deal with problems, because then they're more likely to lash out. So both can be true, but at a minimum, it means you have to have a slightly less knee-jerk way of thinking about the US-China economic relationship. That it maybe you don't want them to have the lead from a narrow US national security viewpoint. You don't want them to have the lead in certain sectors, but you also don't want them to be destabilized. You want them to be relatively happy and prosperous so they're not looking to lash out, but you don't want them getting ahead. It's a more nuanced situation. Of course, for economists and market people, we tend to believe the economics is win-win for the most part. But I just want to sort of situate this relationship in terms of the big picture national security that's going on. And so it also is important and difficult, then you have to sort out the signal. It's not enough to look at Chinese GDP data and say, oh, they're doing well, therefore X, or they're doing badly, therefore X. You have to make a more nuanced case. They're doing well in this industry. They're not doing well in keeping middle-class people or young people employed. You got to go a level down in how you think about these things. So then we get to the question, what does the Trump administration actually want from China? And as I mentioned, they have not stated, the president, nor have any of his appointees or nominees have not yet stated a clear picture of what their strategic goals are. And to be fair, we had something of the same effect with the Biden people, because if you said to then National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan or then U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai, what is it you want from China? What would be their off-ramp that if they did X, Y, Z, you'd lift the sanctions or lift the trade? And the answer always was, no, these are indefinite. And it's like, okay, so is your goal to destroy China's economy? Well, we can't say that. Okay, I'm glad you can't say that. But a strategy, if you're putting out a policy, generally it's because you want a reaction. You want a response. So anyway, to make an old analogy, if you've seen, some of you remember the old James Bond movie Goldfinger, there's a scene where Sean Connery as Bond is strapped to a table and a laser is working its way up towards him. And Bond is trying to save himself and he says, "Do you want me to talk?" And the villain Goldfinger says, "No, Mr. Bond, I want you to die." Anyway, sometimes it feels that way with the people in Congress and the US government. It's like, it's not they're trying to extract some change in behavior or some concession from China. It's just, and that's insane. Okay. So, there are a bunch of possible things you could want. You could want to limit their foreign influence. You could want to limit their territorial expansion. You could want to limit dependence of the US on Chinese production of specific things. You could want to forestall Chinese technological progress, presumably in national security fields, not just to be mean. Do you want to reduce bilateral trade deficits? As a card-carrying macroeconomist, I couldn't care less, but the president cares a great deal. Do you want to deter specific hostile behavior? There's a whole bunch of things you could be doing, and nobody in the Biden administration and nobody so far in the Trump administration, even though the Trump administration had many months to set this out, has said what they want, except perhaps Trump himself. And so one of the most revealing and surprising things about the last 2 weeks of news, which Jim rightly refers to as chaos, particularly in our, or maybe you didn't use chaos, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but rightly referred to as very newsy, is that Trump has very deliberately not put high tariffs on China, put much higher tariffs on Mexico and Canada. In fact, he and his appointees have made lots of statements pretty threatening to Taiwan and not to China, both economically and national security. Now, again, this is not about what I think is right or wrong, although I hope I'm being pretty clear what I think is right or wrong, but just pointing out this is very striking. And so the question is, does Trump want to negotiate something with China and be, in a sense, much more pragmatic than many of the people on his foreign policy team, at least ostensibly, want to be, and then the Biden people want to be? It's an interesting question. It remains to be seen. Would that then diffuse in a useful way for the world the US-China tensions? Possibly, or at least contribute. I mean, there's a whole long list of stuff where, frankly, the Biden administration talked about but never got anywhere, where there's room for US-China cooperation, particularly in reducing the chance of accidents between two nuclear powers with navies wandering around the South China Sea, on environment, on public health. So I don't want to foreclose that possibility, but it's just very striking that so far Trump is putting tariffs on our literal military allies and not doing much of anything on China, either rhetorically or in actually policy. Now, what 10% tariff on China is still pretty damaging. So our colleagues, McKibben, Noland, and others have run simulations. And this gives you, again, it depends on the specific sense. This gives you a sense of what happens to real GDP if you put on some tariffs on China. And it's not a huge number. It's worse for China initially than for the US. It's not a big deal. But what could be a big deal is a much bigger break in US-China economic relations. And that would be the revoking of China PR. So some of you in the room know this, some of you don't. Forgive me for spelling this out. So starting with the literal spelling. PNTR stands for Permanent Normal Trading Relations. This is US Congress speak for what the rest of the world calls most favored nation status. So basically, until China became a member of the WTO in 2000, every year Congress would renew the equivalent of most favored nation status, but they called it normal trading. There have been proposals, legislative bills in both houses of Congress, sponsored by people from both parties, to withdraw China PNTR. And what that would mean is effectively going back to the pre-Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 100 years ago on Chinese goods. And this is where, if President Trump got his 60% tariffs on China number he used to talk about, if it came from anywhere, this is where it came from, because essentially it means a 60% tariff across the board on China. And in addition, it totally upends the rationale for cross-border investment between China and the US, because then PNTR is no longer P, it's no longer permanent. It might be restored someday, it might not be restored, Congress might arrogantly try to renew it every year. Anyway, then you get some very chunky numbers. Oops. I have 5 minutes. Then you get some very chunky numbers on both inflation and growth. And these probably understate the damage, because this would be a violation of everything US has agreed to in the world trading system. This would be essentially a declaration of economic war. And most importantly, this could be done by legislation from Congress without any action from the president. Now, interestingly, in the spirit of what I was just saying about Trump may be more pragmatic, my scenario, my expectation is President Trump or his designate will go to she or his designate and say, look, Congress is bat crazy, hates you, and is going to pass withdrawal of PNTR. I, wonderful President Trump, am the only thing that stands between you and that, because either I can veto it or I can negotiate with them that I am the one who decides on trading status rather than Congress. So therefore, you need to give me the following concessions to keep Congress at bay. And this would be a more pragmatic, though probably less damaging, though not great scenario. And there are echoes of this if you go back to the 80s and the interactions with Japan in particular, but also Germany and some other trading partners, or with Korea in the early 2000s, in which presidents would go to trading partners and say, Congress is going to do the following to you. I'm the reasonable one. Give me some concessions that I can take to Congress. Of course, we still don't know what those concessions would be. Now, briefly, I'm going to go more normative rather than positive, to use an economics distinction. In this article in Foreign Affairs a year and a half ago, and subsequently in small ways, I have been pushing for the bumper sticker I call suction, not sanction. This is not the most felicitous phrase, but it gets the message across. Rather than trying to cut off and constrain the Chinese economy, I would argue the US and its allies should be trying to draw out as much capital, intellectual, human, physical, and otherwise from it, trying to play on the economic long COVID, scared aspects of the Chinese people, a Chinese business about the current regime, and undermine and weaken the Chinese regime in an indirect, peaceful way of saying, hey, Chinese talent, Chinese people, Chinese business, Chinese technology is welcome here. And the recent news about DeepSeek shows at a minimum that export controls and tech barriers are not terribly effective in what economists would call general equilibrium. Because, and a colleague of mine, Martin Cherzempa, is testifying before a House committee on this, I think tomorrow, that if you put up these kinds of sanctions and export barriers, yeah, they may somewhat interfere with technological progress, but they may also incentivize greater resources and innovation and adaptation, or even greater IP theft by the sanctioned country. And in addition, they're very costly to sustain in terms of what you impose on your allies, what you impose on the companies. I know San Diego is the home of Qualcomm, for example, and Qualcomm has a lot of income from China. And you maintain a lot of tech controls, it's harder for Qualcomm to make a living and spend on R&D. And we saw something analogous and is more familiar to people in the financial sanctions realm, which is if you overdo the financial sanctions too much, then there's an incentive to try to set up a network outside the dollar. Whereas if you keep countries, the financial sanctions within limits, then keep using the dollar and you keep having influence and insight into what they're doing. So anyway, I would argue we should take a page from the way we treated fascist regimes in the late 30s and the Soviet Union in the late 70s and late 80s, open up the US economy to the flight of talent and all from those countries. And it would underscore diplomatically that the target is the Communist Party of China and not the or certain behaviors of them, not the giant people of China. And this would ideally, maybe not huge, but would present gains economically for the US rather than costs. Let me be very clear. When I presented this to staffers at the Biden White House, they laughed at me. So, and I assume the same would happen, but it's very unlikely I will get a similar invite to even present at the Trump White House, at least for the time being. So that's where we are. I hope it was okay. I went a little more into some of the Trump background and the long-term background on China. It's a very sophisticated group, and so I hope this is fuel for discussion. Thank you.